Slaves are raped, tortured, starved, humiliated, and drugged.
Stark exploitation of children.
तेरे को मैं अभी लेके आई ना, अभी तू कुछ कर नहीं पाएगी और यहाँ पे निकालने का भी जगह नहीं है, कुछ नहीं है.
Slavery is abhorrent in any circumstance, but child slaves, whether they're exploited for forced labor or sex, commercial sex, it's a very difficult encounter, I think, for anyone.
It's estimated that there were close to 29 million slaves at the end of 2006. The biggest surge has been in sex slavery, where pimps and madams force millions of women and young children into sex for profit. To discuss this growing global industry, we're joined by Siddharth Kara.
In the summer of 2000, I realized there was not an adequate level of understanding and research of these crimes. And with my particular background in business and more recently law, I felt that if someone can really grasp the numbers here and give us reliable data and a reliable understanding of the magnitude of these crimes, we can design more effective interventions.
Poor or marginally subsistent individuals are highly vulnerable to exploitation due to economic desperation. Once acquired, victims are swiftly broken down through physical and psychological torture. The sort of policies and governance of economic globalization created three primary origins of today's trafficked sex slaves. And those areas are South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Central and East Europe. In general, the macro movement of slaves is from those poor regions to wealthier regions.
Slaves are raped, tortured, starved, humiliated, and drugged during transportation. Breaking the spirits of slaves continues once the slave is sold. In Falkland Road, a former sex slave named Malaika told me that minors were mercilessly abused when they first arrived and that they were given opium so that they would have sex with clients. If they misbehaved, arms were broken. If they tried to escape, they might have their throats cut in front of the other slaves, providing a visceral lesson in the fate that awaited them should they try to escape.
Sex slavery is thriving primarily because it is by far the most profitable form of slavery in the world. By my calculation, even though at present roughly 4% of the world's slaves are sex slaves, those same slaves generate almost 40% of the profits enjoyed by slave owners worldwide. That massive profit incentive is what drives interest around the world among organized crime networks and small-time criminals alike.
And how does that compare to other lucrative illicit trades like weapons and drugs, for instance?
Part of the logic of my book was to really try to get some reliable data, finally, on slavery and slave profits. Again, by my calculation, the profits generated by all forms of slavery in 2007 was $91.2 billion. That is second only to drug trafficking in terms of global criminal illicit enterprises. To draw an analogy to the war on drugs, the US government spends 300 times more money per year to fight drug trafficking than it does to fight human trafficking. And the economic penalties for trafficking in cocaine, for example, are 20 times greater than the economic penalties against slavery.
Let's talk a little bit about what kind of interventions do and don't work.
The totality of my research into the global sex trafficking industry led me to conclude that there are four main deficiencies in current attempts to abolish these crimes. First, despite increased media and journalistic attention, sex trafficking remains poorly understood.
The second is that the NGOs that are trying to deal with this on the front lines are underfunded and uncoordinated internationally.
Third, the laws against sex trafficking are overwhelmingly anemic and poorly enforced.
The fourth is that, at least hopefully until my book, a more detailed sort of economic understanding of the crimes hadn't really been put forth. The coalition I describe and the tactics I propose are meant to address these four main impediments to a more effective response to sex trafficking. The enormity and pervasiveness of global sex trafficking is driven by the ability to generate immense profits at almost no real risk. The most effective way to attack profitability is to elevate real risk. In the book, I call this an inversion of the risk-reward economics of the global sex trafficking industry, and I describe 7 tactics that I believe will accomplish this goal.
First is the creation of an international slavery and trafficking inspection force operationally similar to weapons inspectors utilized by the United Nations. Second is the creation of trade and, in some cases, paid community vigilance committees consisting of volunteers, members of the community, business owners, and specially trained individuals who will keep their eyes and ears open for slaves, thereby advancing the moral rigor of this global abolitionist coalition and the presence of law enforcement. We have to institute targeted, proactive law enforcement raids against establishments for which there is a strong suspicion of slave-like exploitation, with protections in place to minimize adverse effects against individuals, slaves or otherwise, living in those establishments. We have to increase funding for salaries for anti-trafficking police, prosecutors, and judges. Right now, the acceptance of bribes and other forms of corruption is a key barrier to the success of the justice process. A prosecutor in Moldova makes about $150 a month, a judge about $200 a month, a slave owner makes tens of thousands of dollars per slave per year, so offering a bribe that's equal to 1 year's annual income to a judge is no more than a small cost of business for that slave owner.
The actual leveraged impact of rule of law is miraculous. All you need to do is establish a credible deterrent, and the people who once were slave masters decide they need to get out of that business.
I think less about rule of law as a vehicle for change and more about the impossibility of change without rule of law.
We have to institute specialized fast-track courts to prosecute trafficking crimes, with international observers and judicial review to minimize corruption. Fully funded witness protection for slaves and their families for the duration of the trial is crucial, as well as up to 12 months afterwards. Many cases fall apart because of threats against former slaves who are too afraid to testify, or because of economic desperation, they cannot sit around for 8, 9, 12, 18 months while cases take place. They need to go find a way to make a living. Finally, a massive increase in the financial penalties associated with sex slave crimes, perhaps to the level of drug trafficking crimes. This financial increase, along with the increased prosecution and conviction levels achieved through the above, should elevate the real risk and cost of sex trafficking to an economically detrimental level. If someone like me is able to track down slaves and confront their exploiters, then more aggressive interventions and elevated resources can surely bring an end to these grotesque crimes. Slavery is a stain on humankind that must be buried alongside our ugliest demons.
And I would like to end with one more narrative shared with me by a young girl I call Sushila in a shelter in Kathmandu called Shakti Samua, and it's the first shelter in Asia that was founded by former victims of sex trafficking. When I was young, I helped my father work in a rice mill. The owners of the mill had a 20-year-old son who came to my room every night and raped me. I was only 11 years old, so the pain was terrible. My father did not believe me when I told him. Eventually, I could not take it anymore, and I ran away. By evening, I sat in front of a shop, and a woman approached me and said I could work in her hotel. A few days later, she took me on a bus and gave me ice cream. I fell asleep. I do not remember anything after that. When I woke up, I was in another house of a Nepali woman. She took me to a bungalow in Mumbai. There were hundreds of girls in this bungalow. I did not want to go inside, but I was beaten and locked in a room. That evening, the gharwali, the house manager or madam, came to my room and said I was sold for 40,000 rupees, about $890. She said I had to do sex work to pay this money back. I told her I had already been raped and I could not bear to be with men. I thought no one had touched you, she shouted. I paid the virgin price. She burned me with cigarettes and beat me with a wooden ladle. I was black and blue and my entire back was bruised. I cried the entire night. The next day, another prostitute told me if I wanted to eat, I should start to work. I told her I would rather starve. After 4 days, another woman from the Mahato caste tried to convince me. I still refused. After 1 week, a Japanese man came. They made an arrangement for me with this man for 60,000 rupees. They told him I was a virgin. The Japanese man stayed with me for 2 weeks. I was forced to be with him, even though the pain was unbearable. 4 days after the Japanese man left, another customer came. I was still bleeding, so the man went to the gharwali and shouted, "Why did you send me to a woman having her period?" The gharwali asked me if I was having my period, but I told her it was from the wounds in my vagina. The malik, the brothel boss, called the doctor and he stitched my wounds. I was given rest for 3 days, then I was forced to be with customers. My stitches opened and I started to bleed again. This process happened 12 times. I do not know how many years I was in Kamathipura. I used to be with 25 customers a day. If we felt we would faint from the pain, the gharwali gave us medicine. We had to keep making sex with customers no matter what. When the Indian police conducted a raid in January 1996, they found me. After the rescue, I was kept in a shelter for 7 months. The Nepalese government would not allow us to return. They said, The prostitutes are a reservoir of AIDS from India who will spread the disease in Nepal. With the help of NGOs, we were finally allowed to return to Nepal. They flew all of us back on 2 planes. The people in Nepal came to the airport and spat on us. They said they would contract AIDS just by touching us. I was lucky not to have AIDS, though I had other sexually transmitted diseases. I am still on medication.